I'm going to dedicate this rant to all the elders, all of them, majority of my grandfather's friends. These were real men, not these fake ass niggas that they making nowadays. These were real men. So I'm dedicating this rant to Mr. Ballant, Mr. Calloway, even Shaky Jake, but definitely to my grandfather. I think the reason why my grandfather invested so much time in me is because he even knew his own son was a major fuck up. My grandfather taught me at a young age to hold a door for a lady, pull the chair back, help her with her coat. All these traits I learned, I practiced. But these traits weren't geared up for today's thoughts. Hell, I started going to school with thoughts before thoughts was even thought up as a word. But watching all these gentlemen interact with their families and their wives, it was a time that'll never return. I mean, these men really took care of their wives and their families, not like these motherfuckers today where they got three, four different baby mamas. Maybe they be married, sometimes they not being married. And even if they are married and shit, ain't nobody faithful no more. I don't get it. I'm gonna tell you about Mr. Calloway. This is my grandfather's good friend from the army. They went to Korea together. Mr. Calloway was a nice man. What stood out to me is that he was married to a white woman. Now we're talking about like the mid to late 70s. It was the first interracial couple that I've ever seen in my life. Now, Mrs. Calloway, don't get me wrong, she was as nice as she could be. Always treated me kind when I came over with my granddaddy. I remember at this particular time, Mr. Calloway, he had these two German shepherds. They were his babies. He had a son with this woman, but he had gotten on some dope and he was no longer um, in touch with his family, let's put it like that. But on this particular day, when my grandfather and I came, because we would go over there after we dropped my grandmother off at church, and we go over there and then we wait for church to let out, because my grandfather wasn't a church going man. I think he knew what was up. But I think this was like the third time I'm going over. There were some of his son's old friends that were throwing rocks at his dog through the fence. And Mr. Calloway, he didn't really raise his voice. You know, he was a soft-spoken man, but he was stern. And he just went out there and said, "Hey, don't hurt my dogs." And they stopped. Sadly, two out of those three boys, his son's old friends, would come back 7 years later when Mr. Calloway was off on a fishing trip and Mrs. Calloway was home alone with the dogs. And these two boys broke into this house, strangled Mrs. Calloway, and robbed the house blind. It's the only time I've seen Mr. Calloway filled with rage. I think the boys were caught like a week later or something. But Mr. Calloway started drinking heavy after that. This caused a problem because when my grandfather and I used to go over there, my grandfather used to partake. And sometimes he didn't know when to stop. Then when we get ready to go and we pull up at the church to pick my grandmother up, when she sat in and she smelled the liquor, there goes the fighting. Not physical fighting, just words. My grandfather never hit my grandmother. They argued though. She hated for him to take me over there. She wouldn't have cared if he went over there by himself, but because he had me, she had a real problem with that. We made it home that day, no problem. But I saw a change in Mr. Calloway, though he always treated me kind. He said I'd be a good boy and I'd go places. My grandfather and him would always say that about me and shit. And I think that's one thing that my uncle hated, even though he hated me when the day I came home from the hospital. This motherfucker was plotting and planning my demise. I don't know how long. And after my grandfather passed, he put his plan into play. Dirty motherfucker even sent his own son to the Fed joint for a $7,000 plus reward. Talk about another friend of my grandfather. His name was Mr. Ballant. He was a painter. He painted our house a couple of times. And he wasn't just a painter, he was my grandfather's friend. Now, mind you, he's a white man, but he wasn't a racist white man. He was like how white people were supposed to be, to treat people out of the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I remember one time my grandfather and I were walking. Mr. Blount was he was with us, but he decided to stay in the car. And my grandfather and I, we got out of the car. We were heading to it was a hardware store. And we passed this one like it's like a hippie van. It wasn't all painted like that, it just looked like a hippie van, an old Volkswagen van that got a tire in the front of it, you know. There were a bunch of these, I guess my grandfather called them hippies. They had long hair and shit. But as we're passing, one of these boys calls us some niggers. And before my grandfather could really turn around, his friend Mr. Ballant jumped out of this car. Didn't know he had no 38 in his pocket. He walked up on these three kids in this van and dared them to say it again and made them apologize to my grandfather and me. These are three white, what, maybe 17, 18, 19. Those are the type of white friends my grandfather had in his corner. Not some backwoods hick and shit that He ain't never seen no black folks before, so the first thing that comes out of his mouth is nigga this and nigga that. That white man was getting ready to plug them for us. He didn't like that racist shit. I mean, he talked about them. He talked about them hippies and shit. I haven't heard so much continual motherfuckers this and punk bitches that and punks and oh, he was going off. I didn't know he could cuss like that. But I knew right there that was a true friend to my grandfather. You don't have friends like that anymore. I certainly don't. You know, that was a time when Archie Bunker said when men were really men. Now, these males, they're not men. These males can't even wear a simple pair of pants and a belt the right way. Because I'm sorry, sagging is fagging. Your next stop is a motherfucking Bloomingdale dress. I don't try to explain nothing to these youngsters. I just stay in my own lane. I don't know what the fuck's wrong with these young motherfuckers now. I was watching video clips of the civil unrest in Chicago that happened a couple nights ago. And there is this one young motherfucker videotaping himself on live breaking into an ATM machine. And this motherfucker didn't even have a mask on. That's got to be the new age of stupid right there. Now, I understand a lot of them people were opportunists. I can say right now, you know, if I was caught down there and shit, there's no fucking way I'd run into any of them motherfucking stores. I pay for what I want. I don't steal shit. But I do understand their rage. Police weren't killing people like this back in the 80s. I mean, with the social media and everybody got a camera on their phone and shit, we seeing it every day. I guess I'll end this one right here because I got to go and take my insulin. I can feel my feet getting ready to do the damn neuropathy. Sitting up here rubbing them is not really helping, so that tells me maybe it's time for about 25 cc's. I'm Hayes, y'all, and it's another rant in the black. Ain't nothing special. Just some things I wanted to talk about. I don't have no siblings or anything like that, so I just talking to the net. You can't respond to anything like that because I've taken all the comments and everything off. I don't. Hey, hold on a second. Let me end this live and I'll be right down, okay? I gotta go. Nini's waiting for me.